Greetings, students. Welcome back to the English class. Now, let us do the question and answers from the chapter Mother's Day. Okay? Now, let us read the question number 1. What does it say? Okay? Question number 1. Now, the play is written in 1950s, is a humorous and satirical depiction of the status of the mother in the family. What are the issues it raises, and do you think it caricature these issues, or do you think that the problem it raises are genuine? How does the play resolve the issues? Do you agree with the resolution? Now let's answer. Now, what is the first of all? We'll know the meaning of caricature. See, it's here, caricature. Okay, it is a picture or description of somebody that makes his or her appearance or behavior funnier and more extreme than it really is. Okay, now let's move to the answer. Now the play raises many serious issues. ठीक है, जो प्ले है वो बहुत ज़्यादा सीरियस इश्यूज रेस करता है. The first and the foremost is the proper appreciation of the housewife's role and responsibility. Those who work 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week treat the housewife as an unpaid domestic work who must कैरी आउट देयर ऑर्डर्स. मतलब जो बाहर जाते हैं काम करने के लिए, वो अपनी हाउस वाइफ्स को कैसे ट्रीट करते हैं, जैसे कि वो अनपेड डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स हों. राइट, फॉर और कितने घंटे काम करते हैं? 8 आवर्स अ डे एंड 40 आवर्स अ वीक करते हैं. तो वो क्या सोचते हैं कि जो उनकी मदर है, जो हाउस वाइफ है, वो क्या करें? सिर्फ ऑर्डर्स को कैरी करें. दे नीदर रिक्वेस्ट हर नॉर थैंक हर फॉर हर सर्विसेज. वो क्या करते हैं? रिक्वेस्ट भी नहीं करते हैं और थैंक यू भी नहीं बोलते हैं. द सेकेंड इशू इज द रेसिप्रोसिटी. मतलब जैसे मैं किसी को लव दूंगी तो वो भी मुझे लव देगा. ठीक है, वेयर इज रेसिप्रोसिटी इज हियर. Right now, of love and gratitude towards the mother of wife. वो बोलता है द सेकेंड इशू इज कि अगर माना कि मदर लव दे रही है तो उनको वो लव नहीं मिल पा रहा है. राइट, द हस्बैंड, सन एंड डॉटर लीव द लेडी ऑफ द हाउस अलोन एवरी नाइट एंड गो ऑन टू एंजॉय देमसेल्व्स इन देयर सेवरल वेज. तो अब वो क्या बोल रहा है कि जो हमने मदर्स डे पढ़ा था उसमें क्या देखा गया है कि जो हस्बैंड है या डॉटर है, सन है, बाहर चले जाते हैं, अपनी मदर को अकेले छोड़ जाते हैं और वहाँ अपना इंजॉय करते हैं. दे डू नॉट टेक एनी नोटिस ऑफ हर एंड हैव बिकम थॉटलेस एंड सेल्फिश. उनका कोई ध्यान नहीं रखता और बहुत ज़्यादा थॉटलेस और सेल्फिश हो चुके हैं. द मदर्स एक्सेसिव लव, केयर एंड प्रॉम्प्टनेस टू सर्व देम ऑल्सो स्पॉइल्स देम. और ये भी मदर की गलत बात है कि जो उनका बहुत ज़्यादा प्यार है, केयर है, उनको स्पॉइल करते हैं. नाउ लेट्स गो टू द सेकेंड पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन. डू यू थिंक इट कैरिकेचर दीज इश्यूज, or do you think that the problem it raises are genuine? How does the play resolve the issues? Do you agree with the resolution? Now the problems the play raises are serious. जो play problem को raise कर रहा है बहुत ज़्यादा serious है. The treatment is of course comic. मतलब जो उनका treatment है, जो उससे प्रॉब्लम सोल्यूशन मिला है, वो थोड़े ह्यूमरस वे से करा है. ठीक है, द प्लेराइट अडॉप्ट्स एन अनयूजुअल मेथड टू रिजॉल्व द इश्यूज. ही टेक्स द हेल्प ऑफ द मैजिक ऑफ द ईस्ट. ओके, तो मैजिक कहाँ लेते हैं? वो मैजिक ऑफ द ईस्ट. सो इट इज ऑफ. ओके, दिस इज नॉट बी, दिस इज ओ. Incantation of the magical spell helps in the interchange of personality. It says that incantation. Now, what does the word incantation mean, children, out here? See, where is the word incantation then? The word incantation is out here. See, now incantation means special words that have a magical effect. When someone sung or chanted, the act of speaking, singing or chanting the words, ठीक है, of magical spell जब बोलते हैं, helps in the interchange of personality. अब magic spell होता है तो personalities exchange होता है. Now Mrs. Pearson, with the strong and sinister personality of Mrs. Fitzgerald, gives rough treatment to the daughter, son and husband respectively. A stern look, strict looks, and commanding tone suggest to them that she can be really tough. The spoilt member are brought around by the heavy dose of exposure of reality to them. They agree to stay and help in preparing the supper while the housewife has a talk with the husband. The resolution of the issue seems to be far-fetched and unnatural, but extreme means have to be adopted in disaster मैनेजमेंट. तो वो बोल रहा है कि लास्ट में हमने देखा जैसे जो उनका पर्सनालिटी है चिल्ड्रन वो एक्सचेंज होने के बाद जो मिसेस पियर्सन है वो बहुत ज़्यादा स्ट्रिक्ट हो जाती है, उनकी वॉइस बहुत ज़्यादा स्टर्न हो जाती है, राइट. और वो क्या करती है, उनको अच्छे से डोज देती है, ठीक है, रियलिटी का. और फिर उनको बोलती कि खाना बनाओ, मैं अपने हस्बैंड से बात कर रही हूँ. और इस ये चीज़ें क्या है, द रेजोल्यूशन ऑफ द सीम्स फार-फेच्ड एंड अननेचुरल बट एक्सट्रीम मीन्स हैव टू बी अडॉप्टेड. बोले ऐसे तो नहीं हो पाता है, ठीक है, बट दीज टाइप ऑफ issues have to be adopted. If you were to write these issues today, what are some of the incidents, examples and problems that you think of as relevant? Various responses are possible. Only such responsible is given below. Various such responses are given. One such response is given below. The incident of unfair treatment of fair sex at home, at work, in public transport, and elsewhere with prove handily. The example of exploitation of female workers with lower wages, harassment by seniors, indecent remarks, eve teasing, and molestation can highlight the problem of social equality that women face in practice. Even in the 21st century, women face the same problem in spite of the talk of women empowerment. The poor housewife have to bear the physical torment and mental anguish, gussa karna, at the hands of bullish husband who boast of their masculinity by inflicting physical violence, barbs, and taunts on the defenseless women. Examples of rapes and sexual harassment which hung the limelight in daily newspaper can also be included to highlight the problems of insecurity of women in modern society. तो यहाँ पर वो क्या बोल रहे हैं कि एग्जाम्पल देना है, तो हमने क्या दिया है, एग्जाम्पल तो हमने दिया है, ठीक है, जैसे कि एक्सप्लॉइटेशन, ठीक है, कहाँ पर इनडिसेंट रिमार्क्स, ईव टीजिंग जो होती है, मोलेस्टेशन होती है, ठीक है, और हस्बैंड्स अपनी वाइफ को बुली करते हैं, मारते पीटते हैं, उनको टॉन्ट मारते हैं, ठीक है. और हमने हमेशा ये एग्जाम्पल कहाँ पे देखा गया, रेप एग्जाम्पल देखे गए कहाँ पर, न्यूज़पेपर्स में. Is drama a good medium of conveying a social message? Discuss. उसने बोला ड्रामा क्या एक गुड मीडियम है कन्वे करने के लिए, क्या चीज़, सोशल मैसेज. डिस्कस. यस, उसने बोला यस, ड्रामा इज certainly a good message for conveying a social message. तो ड्रामा क्या है, एक गुड तरीका है ताकि हम सोशल जो मैसेज है कन्वे कर सकते. डायरेक्ट moralizing is often resented and usually ignored. Drama is presented of a slice of life through characters placed in various situations. The attention of the spectator centers around the action and reaction. Most of them feel fully involved with the protagonist who's actually the speaker, who's the main character of the story. Okay, the working out of the theme generally leaves a message. Sometimes what does it do, obvious and explicit, but in most cases indirect and implicit. The social message, it says, the social message of these plays seems to come out of interaction of characters and their trait of characters. The victory of evil over good is usually portrayed indirectly. These days we find many plays centered around these themes, creating social awareness such as evils of drinking, smoking, dangers of pollution, child labor, the decreasing female ratio, and need to empower women. Now, discuss in groups plays or films with a strong message of social reform that you have watched. ठीक है, for group discussion at class level there can be varied response. One such response is given. The latest film I had watched recently is Swadesh. Okay. Okay, Swadesh. It has a strong message of social reforms. It tells the story of Indian scientist at NASA America who visits his ancestral home in India. The poor condition of villagers and lack of basic facilities fills him with deep agony. He resigns his job in America and returns to his native country, Swadesh. Swadesh means Apna Desh, to begin his work of rural upliftment. He gives the villagers a message that self help is the best help and we cannot depend for everything on the government. This remote village is plunged in darkness after sunset and there is no electricity. With the help of a few villagers, the scientist is able to produce hydroelectricity and light the village homes. The message can be used for irrigation, the water can be used for irrigation purposes also. Thus the economic and social condition of villagers undergoes a sea change, a drastic change. A second example you can give of a movie Pink, okay, where a girl was raped, right? And when she was raped by one of the ministerial high ministerial son. Okay, so you can talk about the social change in that, or where women are molested, they have eve teasing. Now some more questions solved, short answer questions. how are how was Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald contrasted? उनका नेचर के बारे में बताना है. The two ladies were sharply contrasted. वो एक दूसरे से बहुत ज़्यादा अलग थी. Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant but worried looking woman in her 40s. तो मिस पियर्सन है वो क्या है, बहुत ज़्यादा वर्ried है. ठीक है, और वो कहाँ कितने हमें दिखती है 40 years की. She speaks in light flurried sort of tone with a touch of suburban cookney. ठीक है. Now Mrs. Fitzgerald is older, heavier and has a strong and sensitive personality. She smokes. She has a deep voice, rather Irish tone. Okay. Next question. I'm much obliged, says Mrs. J. Pearsons. Now, what for does she feel obliged and to whom? Mrs. Pearson feels obliged to Mrs. Fitzgerald for telling her fortune. She thinks it quite wonderful having a real fortune teller living next door. What fortune does Mrs. Fitzgerald predict for Mrs. Pearson? क्या फॉर्चून बताया था, क्या उनके लिए भविष्यवाणी करी थी? मिसेस फिट्जराल्ड इज क्वाइट evocable in her prediction. She says it could be a good fortune or a bad one. All depend on Pearson herself now. She asks her to decide firmly. Her fortune depends on it. What problem does Mrs. Pearson face? क्या problem थी जो Mrs. Pearson face कर रही थी? Do you think is responsible for state of affairs? बोरी क्या तुम सोच सकते वही इन चीज़ों की responsible हो? Now, Mrs. Pearson devotes all her time and energy to serve her husband, son, and daughter. These thoughtless and selfish persons go out every night to enjoy themselves, leaving Mrs. Pearson alone at home. She is no better than a servant in their own home. Mrs. Pearson herself is responsible for the ill treatment, neglect, and lack of concern shown to her. What course of action does Mrs. Fitzgerald suggest to Mrs. Pearson to tackle the situation? Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson to decide firmly and stick to her decision. She must assert her position and become the real mistress of the house. Her own initiative can help her. She must tell her wait or look after themselves for once. Now, what difficulties does Mrs. Pearson face while dealing with the various members of her family? क्या प्रॉब्लम थी जो मिसेस पियर्सन फेस कर रही थी? मिसेस पियर्सन लव्स हर हस्बैंड एंड चिल्ड्रन टू मच. ठीक है. शी डज नॉट फाइंड करेज इनफ टू डिस्कस द प्रॉब्लम विद देम. She only helps dropping hints. She hates any unpleasantness. She does not know where to start. She does not know how to begin discussion with the other members of the family. Now, next question. Question number 7. Then let me do it, suggests Mrs. Fitzgerald. How does Mrs. Pearson react to it? How does Mrs. Pearson react to it? Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald offers to deal with the family of Mrs. Pearson and teach. Now, then let me do it, suggests Mrs. Fitzgerald. How does Mrs. Pearson react to it? Mrs. Fitzgerald offers to deal with the family of Mrs. Pearson and teach them to treat her properly. Mrs. Pearson feels flustered. She thanks her, saying that it would it wouldn't do at all. They would resent being ill-treated from somebody else and wouldn't listen. Now, how does Mrs. Fitzgerald plan to deal with the family of Mrs. Pearson? She tells Mrs. Pearson that she will deal with the family not as herself but as Mrs. Pearson. ठीक है. They will change places or really bodies. So they'll change the soul. Mrs. Pearson would then look like Mrs. Fitzgerald and the latter would look like the former. What does Doris Pearson feel astounded? Astound means shocked on returning home. Why does? So Doris finds her mother smoking away, lighting another cigarette and laying out the cards for patience on the table. She shoots her query about ironing her yellow silk, but feel astounded on seeing her mother's behavior. What are the two reasons that annoyed Doris Pearson? Firstly, Doris is annoyed that her mother has not ironed her yellow silk dress, which she has to wear that night. And secondly, she has returned home after working hard all day and mother hasn't even bothered to get her tea ready. Let's do the next question. Why does Mrs. Pearson refute Doris' argument about working hard? Now, Mrs. Pearson tells Doris that she has a good idea how much Doris does. Mrs. Pearson claims that she puts in twice the hours that Doris does and gets no pay or thanks for it. How does Mrs. Pearson criticize Doris on going out with Charlie Spencer? Now, Mrs. Pearson asked Doris if she could not find anyone better than Charlie Spencer. ठीक है. He has buck teeth, buck जिनके teeth बाहर आ चुके हैं, and half-witted, पागल. She wouldn't be seen dead with Charlie Spencer. She's saying that she would not be seen dead with Charlie Spencer. At her age, she would either have found somebody better than Charlie Spencer or stop dating boys on seeing no hope of success. Next, why is Cyril Pearson annoyed with his mother? Give two reasons. Cyril feels annoyed when his mother tells him that the tea is not ready and she couldn't bother about it. He inquires if she is not feeling well and then asks her to be quick as he has to not too much time. His mother has not taken his things out. She has neither mended them nor she is willing to do it. Now, question number 14. That's a nice way to walk. What would happen if we all talked like that? Sorry, it is talk. This is a nice way to talk. What would happen if we all talked like that? Says Cyril. What context does he say so? What argument does he get in return? Now, Mrs. Pearson tells her son Cyril that she has decided now that she wouldn't like mending. Cyril objects to her words. Mrs. Pearson gives him a taste of his own medicine by saying that all of them do work like that. If there's something at home they don't want to do, they don't do it. If it is something at their work, they get the union to bar. ठीक है. If she has now joined the movement. Now, how do Doris and Cyril react to Mrs. Pearson's query about stout? Cyril is the first to react. He hints that she doesn't want stout then, like at that time, uh, uh, at tea time. ठीक है, he remarked that she wants to drink surprises both Cyril and Doris, and they exchange notes regarding her behavioral towards them since they returned home that evening. Okay, question number 16. What changes in the behavior of Mrs. Pearson startled, shocked Doris and Cyril? What possible reasons do they suggest? Now, Doris couldn't believe her eyes when she saw her mother smoking and playing cards. Cyril too noted the change and asked her if she was feeling ill. She looks just the same, but her behavior is suddenly different. Cyril asks if she has gone slightly mad. Doris thinks that she has a concussion as a result of head hitting something. Okay. What does Mrs. Pearson teach her children to be responsible adults? How? Sorry. How does Mrs. Pearson? First, she scolds them for their golfing and giggling. Then, she has a dig at their lifestyles. They just come in, ask for something, go out again, and then return as there is nowhere else to go. When Doris and Cyril boast of doing their work all day, Mrs. Pearson tells them that she has also done her 8 hours. She threatens to have 2 days off at the weekend. Now, but any any of you 40 hours a weekers who expect to be waited on hand and foot on Saturday and Sunday with no thanks for it are in for a nasty disappointed, says Mrs. Pearson. How has she planned to spend the weekend? Now she might do cooking or make a bet or two as a favor only if she is real asked very nicely and thanked for it. They will all have to pay attention to her and show her care and concern. Perhaps she might go off to the weekend. It will provide her a change. She is bored of remaining at home all the time. Now, question number 19. I'll hit you with something, girl, if you don't stop asking silly questions, says Mrs. Pearson's to daughter. What silly question does she object to? Now, Doris at first asks with disbelief if she would go off for a weekend, and she inquires where she would go and with whom. Mrs. Pearson tells her that it is her business and then asks her if she had fallen or hit herself with something. Mrs. Pearson objects to this silly question. Question number 20. Well, that ought to be nice change for you, says Mrs. Pearson. What change does she refer to and how does George react to it? George finds his wife Annie, Mrs. Pearson, drinking stout at a wrong time of the day. Moreover, she has never seen her doing it before. Naturally, he is confused and surprised when he remarks that he doesn't like her drinking and it doesn't look right. Mrs. Pearson remarks about the change in her life. Annoyed because I don't get a tea for him that he doesn't even want, says Mrs. Pearson. What forces her to make this remark? Now, at first, Mrs. Pearson tells his wife that he wouldn't want any tea as there is a supper at the club that night. She feels hurt to know that she hasn't he feels hurt to know that he hasn't prepared any tea when he are supposed he would wanted some. Mrs. Pearson makes it a biting remark. How do you think is George Pearson treated at the club? The members of the club laugh at George Pearson. He, in fact, one of their standing jokes. They call him Pompey Ompy Pearson because they think he is quite slow and pompous. Although his joke is quite famous, George is unaware of it. What object does Mrs. Pearson have against George's going to club so frequently? Now, Mrs. Pearson fails to understand why her husband George wants to spend so much time at the club whereas people are always laughing at him behind his back and calling him names. Leaves his family alone every night. He wouldn't make him look a fool if he went out with her. Sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. Do you agree with Mrs. Pearson's observation? Mrs. Pearson has hurt the feeling of her husband, George, by telling him the truth. She thinks that truth should not hurt anybody for long. I think she is right. It's not good living in fool's paradise. Now, what does Mrs. Pearson doubt the value of Cyril's opinion? She tells Cyril frankly that she knows nothing about the worldly affair. He spends too much money, um, time and money at amusement shows like greyhound races, dirty tricks, and shows. Why is George Pearson considered why is George Pearson incensed at Mrs. Fitzgerald interrances? George reacts with horror and surprise when his neighbor, Miss Fitzgerald, addresses him by his first name, George, instead of the formal Mr. George Pearson. Her second remark, "Oh dear, I thought to have known," further incenses him that he thinks she has business to poke her nose into his family affairs. Next question. Perhaps you'll excuse us. What lesson of civility does Mrs. Pearson teach George Pearson? The Mrs. Pearson tells George that she will not excuse him for his behavior. She asks him to be polite to her friend or neighbor in future. He should greet her politely instead of coming in and sitting down silently. What does Mrs. Pearson threaten? Why does Mrs. Pearson threaten to slap her husband? George feels angry at being humiliated in the presence of neighbor. He loses his temper and asks his wife if she has gone mad. This is too much for Mrs. Pearson to bear. She jumps up and threatens to slap George if he shouts at her again. Either PM offs my chump or you two are. Why do you think George arrives at this conclusion? Mrs. Pearson threatens to slap George if he shouts at her again. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald begins to moan and addressing Mrs. Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald requests her not to do so. George is bewildered and exclaims that either he is mad or both of them are mad. How is Doris taught a lesson in behavior? When Mrs. Fitzgerald remarks that Doris was going out with Charlie Spencer that night, Doris feels annoyed and retorts that she has not gone, nothing, she has got nothing to do with. Now, Mrs. Pearson rebukes Doris harshly and tells her to answer Mrs. Fitzgerald properly. She adds that she won't have her daughter behaving rudely with anyone. What does the real Mrs. Pearson, learn about daughter's miserable state? The real Mrs. Pearson has the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald. At her insistence, Doris tells her that her mother has been criticizing her and making her feel miserable. According to her, Charlie Spencer has a buck teeth and is half-witted. All this has made her miserable. Question number 32. What forces the real Mrs. Pearson to come to conclusion that enough, quite enough? Mrs. Fitzgerald, who has body of Mrs. Pearson, has been quite harsh to George Pearson, Doris and Cyril. The real Mrs. Pearson objects to the comments about Charlie Spencer. Later, when she is bit rude to George, the real Mrs. Pearson feels offended. What is Mrs. Fitzgerald final advice to Mrs. Pearson after reversion of their origin personalities? Mrs. Fitzgerald advises Mrs. Pearson not to go soft on the members of the family again. She should not start explaining or apologizing. She should give them a look or a rough tone of voice now and then to suggest that she might be tough with them. She wanted to be. What would Mrs. Pearson like the members of the family to do? She wanted them to stop at home in the morning and give her a hand with supper. She would also like to play a game of rummy, which she fails to expect at the Christmas. Okay, what does this stern treatment reform spoil children? The children look apprehensively at Mrs. Pearson. However, she smiled back at her as she smiled. Since they are not going out, she suggests having a nice family game of rummy. She tells the children to get the supper ready while she has a talk with their father. The spoiled children meekly obey her. Now, thank you, children. Thank you very much.